So today we're going to be talking about the endocrine system, which works with our nervous system. And we've, of course, just finished our nervous system. You should have seen your nervous system test grades on the CNS, along with your homework activities added in. And what it's going to, the endocrine system is going to coordinate all of your body cells. Now, it does this using hormones. The hormones that the endocrine system uses do send these messages, but the responses are going to be slower and longer lasting than the nervous system. And so the study of the endocrine system is called endocrinology, which is not only the study of these hormones, but also the endocrine organs. And the endocrine system is going to respond to stress, and it also is going to help regulate homeostasis. So here's a couple of functions that the endocrine system controls and regulates. So if there's an endocrine problem, one of these functions may be thrown off. For example, growth and development can be thrown off. So you need to be aware of those. I'm not going to insult your intelligence and read those to you. All right. And so as we're looking at the endocrine system, something you need to be aware of is that prefix endo. Endo means within, of course, and the endocrine glands found all over the body, they don't have ducts. So they're not like an exocrine gland that would be like a sweat gland that's going to secrete sweat to outside the body. So you just need to be aware of the difference between the endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. Here's some examples of exocrine glands that we've already studied this year. Your salivary glands, your sweat glands that produce breast milk. So just a couple of exocrine glands for you. Now these have ducts, as you can see. Look at the first one. That salivary gland has ducts that are going to release that sweat, or excuse me, that saliva outside the body. But your endocrine glands include your pituitary, your thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal glands, pineal glands. The hypothalamus that we just finished studying in the nervous system is called a neuroendocrine gland because it has some neural functions and endocrine functions. Now, some of the glands that are part of the endocrine system also have exocrine functions, which means they have ducts and they can secrete things outside the body. These would be the pancreas, gonads. So gonads in females are the ovaries in males, the testes, the placenta. There are other organs that also secrete hormones that you should be aware of. The thymus, for example, is one that we'll talk about. All right, so here are the glands that you need to know. 3 of them you already know because we've been studying them as part of the nervous system: the pineal, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary. So obviously you know where those are located in the brain, so you can jot down the location. Now, right in your neck, if you take a look right here, and you can actually feel this gland. It should be right where your Adam's apple is. And if you swallow, you should be able to feel the thyroid gland move up and down. It's sort of like a butterfly-shaped gland right in there. Now, on the thyroid, you can see the thyroid here in pink. They're sort of like in an orangish red. Those little round studs are parathyroid glands. So they kind of hitchhike on the thyroid gland. And so you do need to know both of those. Now, not pictured here, but it would be right in this location here, just superior to the heart, is the thymus gland. So you need to know that one as well. In young people such as yourselves, your thymus gland would still be active. And somebody who's older like me, the thymus gland is probably not even visible. The next gland sitting on top of the kidneys are the adrenal glands, sometimes called the suprarenal glands nowadays. Then, and I'm sure you already know the location of the pancreas. If you don't, right there by your stomach, sort of a leaf-shaped organ. It does have digestive function. Remember, it is an exocrine gland, but it has endocrine function as well. And then the male and female gonads. In females, the ovaries, in males, the testes. So make sure you jot down the location of each of those glands. You do need to know where they are located. All right, so how do these endocrine glands work? They work with something that are chemical messengers. So they're secreting chemicals that we call hormones. Now, these hormones are long distance chemical signals, not like the nervous system where the presynaptic neuron secretes the neurotransmitter to the postsynaptic neuron. These hormones travel long distances, like a hormone might travel from the pituitary in the brain to the ovaries. So they're going to travel a long distance through the blood or lymph. There are two different types of hormones that you should be aware of. Lipid soluble. Lipid soluble, obviously, they dissolve in fat. They won't dissolve in water. These hormones can go into the cell. They have to travel through the bloodstream with a protein carrier because your blood is primarily water-based. The other type of hormones are water-soluble hormones. Now, these hormones can travel right through the blood. Remember, the blood is mostly water-based, and they cannot go into the cells. And I've given you some examples of these different hormones there. T3 and T4, those lipid-soluble hormones, probably the most important ones. Those are a couple of your thyroid hormones. All right. So how do these hormones act? Well, here's what they do. They circulate throughout your entire body systems, and only a cell that has a receptor for that hormone can receive that hormone. So those hormones are traveling around, and then when they come to a cell that has a receptor for that hormone, it's called a target cell. The hormones then will change the activity of the cell. Now, keep in mind that this action is going to be a little bit longer lasting, and it's going to be a little bit slower getting started. So again, here's one of our big ideas, that those hormones are chemical messengers and they act on target cells. And so you can see here in this picture the endocrine gland secreting its hormones there in purple. The hormones are traveling through the bloodstream, and they're going to a specific target cell. Notice they pass the other cell because the receptor is not going to accept that hormone. And so this is just kind of a little summary of how that works. And a reminder that these target cells can remove the receptors and become less sensitive to the hormone. That's called downregulation. Or the target cell can add receptors. So if you look at this target cell here in this picture, you can see that right now it has 3 receptors. If it added receptors, then it could receive more of the hormone. So it's going to have more of an effect. That's called upregulation. Or it could remove those receptors, downregulation. And so how do these hormones affect the target cells? Well, keep in mind that depending upon if they're water soluble or fat soluble, that's going to determine whether they can go into the cell or not. And so they can these hormones can cause a cell to reproduce. They can cause a cell to secrete things. They can cause a cell to make proteins. So they can cause lots of different things. They can cause the cell to be more permeable to ions. Remember the ions that hang outside the cells, sodium always hanging outside the cells. And so here's just a little picture for you to see up regulation. I thought this was a great picture, and down regulation. You may even want to snap a picture of that yourself. All right, so how do the hormones work? Well, the lipid-soluble hormones are going to go into the cell. They're probably going to bind to receptors on the target cell. Then they're going to go into the cell. These lipid-soluble hormones can actually alter the gene expression. They can cause new messenger RNA to form. They can have a cell make new proteins and change the cell's activity. Whereas the water-soluble hormones, they're going to have to bind to receptors on the outside of the cell, and then they're typically going to use something that's called a G protein, secondary messenger. And this G protein is going to activate a chemical called adenyl cyclase, which is going to then convert ATP to cyclic AMP, or CAMP is how we refer to that. And so here's just a little picture. And you can see in pink is our water-soluble hormone. It cannot go into the cell. It has a receptor in purple. Attached to that purple receptor is a blue G protein. And so the G protein then is going to receive the message from the secondary messenger. The G protein is going to move over here to the right, and it's going to cause ATP to make cyclic AMP, or CAMP. Here's a little video that you could watch. I did make this a hyperlink for you to see how this works. All right, and so now take just a moment, now that we've been talking about the nervous system and the endocrine system, and see if you can compare these two systems with the chemicals that are used, how they act, the types of target cells, how long the response takes, and how long each action lasts. Like, is it short term or long term? So I would suggest that you pause this video and go ahead and fill in this chart. And so compare your chart to my chart. How did you do? Did you know the two types of chemicals involved? Did you know where they're acting? Remember, our nervous system is activating muscles and glands, but the endocrine system can activate cells all over the body. And then how long the response takes and how long it lasts. All right, so quick little review. What are the two main types of hormones? If you said lipid soluble and water soluble, then you are exactly correct. Which type can enter the cell? Well, if you're thinking about the cells and you're thinking about that phospholipid bilayer, you're probably thinking lipids can enter the cell. And don't forget, your water soluble have to use a secondary messenger, usually a G protein. And so here's a little bit more about how those water-soluble proteins work. Again, they're going to often use cyclic AMP, CAMP, for a signaling messenger. And so here's kind of a series of steps that they go through. So the hormone is the messenger. It activates the G protein. The G protein causes adenyl cyclase to move along, and it converts ATP to cyclic AMP, or CAMP. And that is our secondary messenger. Then that secondary messenger is inside the cell and can go and alert the cell to do things. Generally, it's going to activate things called protein kinases that's going to cause other proteins to form. And this is going to happen right in the cytoplasm or the cytosol of the cell. And so there again is just another picture of how that works. And so you could kind of follow that along, taking a look at how that works. And there's your protein kinases there in green. Here's another chart I thought would be helpful. This doesn't come from your book, it comes from the TAN book, but I just thought that this was a nice summary and comparison of the two types of hormones that you should know. Okay, so what does the responsiveness of the target cell depend on? Well, it depends on a couple things. First, it's going to depend on the concentration of the hormones in the bloodstream or in the lymph. It's also going to depend on how many receptors the target cell has. Also, it can depend on the influences of other hormones. Certain hormones will work together in different ways. And so we're going to take a look at that. And so here's ways that the multiple hormones can operate on the same target cell. Sometimes there can be a permissive effect. Like one hormone can't cause the cell to make any changes without the effect of another hormone being present. So like epinephrine can break down fats, but when thyroid hormone, T3 and T4 are present, much more fat is broken down to give us more energy. So we call this a permissive effect. So if you've ever wondered how epinephrine gives us energy, well, with the presence of thyroid hormones, it's going to give us a lot more energy. The other way that they can act is what we call synergistic. And so you're probably hearing that root word synergy, which is why we sometimes like in classes put you in breakout rooms so that way you can talk and work together. And that's called synergy when you're working together. So an example is glucagon and epinephrine both cause the liver to release glucose. So they're going to work, two hormones that work together that will help us to have more energy, more glucose floating in our bloodstream. Another way they can work together is as antagonists. And so one hormone opposes the other. Like two opposing hormones are insulin and glucagon. Of course, and we just looked at glucagon in our last slide. So insulin helps to remove glucose from our bloodstream, causing the liver and the muscles to store glucose as glycogen. And glucagon causes more glucose to enter the bloodstream. All right. And so how do these endocrine glands know to secrete their hormones? Or to synthesize and then secrete their hormones? So they basically know to secrete their hormones with three different ways. We call these stimuli. First, there can be chemical changes in the bloodstream. They can get signals from the nervous system. You'll remember some of these glands that we've talked about are also part of the nervous system, and other hormones can give the endocrine gland information to secrete their hormone. And so how are our hormones then controlled? Well, they're controlled by what we would call negative feedback system. You may remember at the very beginning of the year, we talked about this negative feedback system for our homeostatic controls. And so there is a set point. So for many of your hormones, there's a set point, an amount of endocrine hormone that should be floating around in the bloodstream. And so some of the endocrine glands are constantly monitoring, okay, how much growth hormone is floating around in our bloodstream? Is this enough to cause our bones and muscles to grow? And so they're watching that sort of level. So thinking about how these hormones know to secrete, one of them is from the nervous system. And of course, let's take a look at those nervous system glands, the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Remember, the pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus with a little stalk called the infundibulum. The pituitary actually secretes 8 major hormones. Now, this pituitary gland has two lobes, and I think I've got a picture of it coming up for you in just a few moments. So there's a posterior pituitary, which is primarily neural tissue, and then the anterior pituitary is glandular tissue. So this is more endocrine. Oh, perfect. And so there's a nice picture of the brain. And you can see the pituitary hanging down there from the infundibulum. You can see the thalamus and hypothalamus. 24 is the hypothalamus. Perfect. And so here is a nice picture of the pituitary. So if we take that pituitary we just looked at and blow it up, here's the posterior pituitary in the back, obviously, and the anterior pituitary in the front. And so we're looking at the two different lobes of the pituitary. And you can see the hypothalamus there, just above the pituitary. And so oftentimes when the hypothalamus secretes hormones, these hormones from the hypothalamus travel through blood vessels to the anterior pituitary, where they can stimulate hormones to be made by the anterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary is going to secrete several hormones: growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone. So if you take a moment to think about that, it does just what it says, stimulates the thyroid. Adrenal corticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. Now, one of the things about these hormones that sometimes people find confusing is you can see right next to these in this purple box here that each hormone often is represented with letters to help us to know what that hormone is. Now, let's take a look at the posterior pituitary. So again, the posterior pituitary produces some hormones as well: oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And then the last thing I think that we'll stop with today is something called the half-life, or the duration of the hormones. How long do they last? Well, the half-life is the time required for the hormone to decrease by half. It could be a few minutes, it could be weeks. And so how do these hormones get removed? Well, sometimes there are degrading enzymes, just like we looked at for the neurotransmitters. The kidneys and the liver will also help to remove hormones from the bloodstream.